In this video, we're going to learn how to process forms with PHP. At this point, I assume that you've done the previous videos, so you understand what variables are, and you understand how to write basic PHP scripts. At least you understand the basic rules. And most importantly, you understand what associative arrays are. I'm not going to cover the basics of what HTML forms are and the various elements of an HTML form. I assume that since you guys understand HTML and are web designers, I'll assume that you know at least that much about forms. That said, I want to cover three aspects about forms that are specific to sending information to a server for processing by a PHP script. Let's start by looking at the form that we're going to be processing with the PHP. Nothing special here, just common stuff. We got some couple of text boxes, radio buttons, drop-down lists, and a text area. Nothing special. Let's take a look at the code. Again, your standard HTML form code. Let's take a look at the form tag itself, and there's a couple of attributes I want to point out. The first attribute we should look at is the action attribute. The action attribute in the form tag tells the web browser where to submit the form data to. So when somebody fills out this form with information, this information has to be sent somewhere. So this action attribute tells the browser where to send this form information to. So in this case, we're sending it to a PHP page called form_response.php. In this PHP page, we'll write the scripts that will actually process the information that the form collects and sends to us. The next attribute I want to look at is the method attribute. This attribute specifies how the form information will be sent to the server. Well, specifically to the script that we specified in the action attribute. You see, there are two different ways in which the browser can send all the data collected. You can either send it the post method or the get method. Typically, you're going to send information using the post method because the post method holds a lot more data. To make an analogy, the post method would be like a truck where you have all that room, whereas the get method would be like a bicycle with a basket in front. The get method does work, but it's very limited in terms of the amount of data that you can send. I'm going to save this, and I want to show you exactly what get looks like. So here's our form. I'm going to refresh it again. Now that it's refreshed, I'm going to put in some, I'll just leave in this name. Email, I'll put in an email address. I'll put Stefan@Kidler. We'll just leave it like that for now. And we're just going to hit submit. Here we are at our target. This is the this URL here. This page corresponds to what we put in our action, right? Our action attribute of the form tag, form_response.php. We go back to this page, form_response.php. Now nothing is happening here because I haven't written any PHP code yet. What I want you to understand is that when you set something, when you set a form to use the get method to send the data, what you're telling the browser to do is to send the information using the query string. This is the query string. Essentially, what that does is basically at the end of your URL, this is the root URL, it appends to it, it adds to it the information contained within the form. So if you notice here, we have name first equals Stefan. So if we go back to our form here, if we look at our first input box, it has a name of name first. And of course, we entered in the text Stefan into that form. What separates the base URL, which is this, right, from the name value pairs, right? We spoke about that in a previous video, name value. We got our name and our value, and that forms a pair. What separates the base URL from the name value pairs, which everything over here is this question mark. So when the server comes across this question mark, it knows that after this question mark, you're sending a bunch of information for a script to process. Get works fine, except it has a couple limitations. A, you can only send about 1,000 characters, these are being characters, through get. So you can only send a very limited amount of information. That's why I used the bicycle analogy with a basket, which is get, very limited amount of information, versus post, which is the other method, which I'm going to explain to you in a moment, which you can send much more information. And finally, the other limitation of get is that when you do send information via get, it does add everything to the query string, so it's not necessarily the safest way to transmit data. Post sends the data behind the scenes, if you will, in the HTTP header. It's crackable and it's accessible, but not nearly as easily. You would use get normally not in forms, but in hyperlinks. Now if I click on the query string here, link, now I just built that in the actual code for query string. I added some extra information, this information here, to send the page some data. So if you decided, for instance, you wanted to track somebody clicking on a particular link, you could do that. Here's the link, by the way. You could add your question mark, and then you'd add the name value pairs that you want to add, and then you can send this information off to a page and then process that information. That will lead to another video on PHP. In the meantime, let's get back to our form. So far we covered the method. We understand what the method is. You have get or post. I'm going to set it back to post because that's the preferred way. And then you have, of course, the action, which is basically telling the form where to submit the form data to. In this case, it's formResponse.php. It's a PHP script. The other thing I want to cover about forms is the name attribute of the various input tags. Again, I assume that you understand forms. So you got your text input fields here, you got your radio input fields, you got your select box input field, etc. In each of these input fields, there's a name attribute. The name attribute is what the PHP script looks for when it's trying to determine what information is coming from the form. So it's very important that you fill in your name attribute for each of your inputs in the form. So I got, for the first text box, name equals first name. Equals name first. The second input, I have name equals email. For the radio buttons, I have name equals color. And if we go down, I got name equals favorite website. You get the idea. To review, the name attribute of your input tags inside of a form are used by the PHP script, and actually every scripting engine, to identify the pieces of information that you're sending with the form over the internet. So it's very important that you add these name attributes, of course. And I also suggest that you use name attributes that make sense. So for instance, in this input tag here, the first one, I want to gather the person's first name. So I gave the name attribute a value of name first. I could have called it first name. I usually go name first, and there's database reasons why I do this, which we'll get into a little later. In terms of the radio buttons, again, I'm asking for the favorite color. So in the actual code, I call it color. Name equals color, name equals color. I could have called it name equals fav color, but color was sufficient because it's pretty self-explanatory within this page. The point is, when you do name your input tags, try to give them names that make sense, that tell you about the data that you're sending over the internet.